Last time we talked about some of the sacrifices of the book of Leviticus. We began Leviticus looking at kind of a big overview a few lessons ago and seeing what's the big point. You have at the end of Exodus this dilemma, you have this problem because you have a holy God and an unholy people, a God who is separate from sin and people who are anything but separate from sin. And Moses cannot enter the place where God has his presence in the tabernacle. You need someone to be able to go in there, and you need a process for that. This is Leviticus. It's like a group of instruction manuals on different parts of what they should be doing, of their religious job as priest, and is even just how to become a priest, how that ordination process begins. We'll get to that soon. But we've been talking first about sacrifices. That's what we see first in Leviticus. And we talked about the burnt offering. We talked about the grain offering, the peace offering. And then last time I ended by mentioning the sin and guilt offerings, which in some ways are kind of similar. The difference we see, the sin offering is, it seems, always for unintentional sin. So if it's something where you are defiantly sinning, then you can't use a sin offering for that. Yet, with the guilt offering, if it's something related to perhaps the sanctuary, like the tabernacle, it says in chapter 5, if anyone commits a breach of faith and sins unintentionally in any of the holy things of Yahweh, and then you have the guilt offering for that, but also for things that are intentional. Chapter 6, it talks about deceiving your neighbor, robbery, oppressing your neighbor, lying. These sorts of things, when you may know full well that that's wrong and you shouldn't be doing it, and you do it anyway, these are where guilt offering comes in. And so we're going to look at those two today. We're going to look at sin offering first. That's chapter 4 and goes on into chapter 5. And then the guilt offering finishes up chapter 5 and goes into chapter 6. Now, remember these chapters, if you're saying, well, why isn't all of chapter 4 a sin offering and then all of chapter 5 be the guilt offering? These chapters are not inspired. These chapters were not there when it was originally written. There were not chapters and verses when Moses wrote this down. These are added later to kind of like break things up and help us be able to say, hey, it's in this exact spot or that exact spot. So we can say it's in chapter 5, verse 3, instead of just saying, well, somewhere in there, kind of, a little ways in, so this, sometimes it may seem odd why a chapter is divided where it is, but, we can just use it for what it's good for and be okay with how sometimes it just seems a little odd, like why don't you just have this whole one section just be a chapter and then have this other section be a chapter? But so, moving on to sin offerings, we see that this is for unintentional sin, and it actually gives different prescriptions for different people. This is something that's kind of different about the sin offering. The burnt offering, it didn't matter who was bringing the burnt offering. Here's what it is, right? The grain offering is the same kind of thing. The peace offering, there's different ones you can bring, but it's not dependent on who you are, right? There's different grain offerings that you can bring, but it's not based on you. It's based just on simply what you're bringing, different options that you have. The sin offering, we see that we have, if it's someone who is a priest, then it's going to be a bull. We see in verse 13, if the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, and the thing is hidden from the eyes of the assembly, and they do any of the things that by Yahweh's commandments ought not to be done, and they realize their guilt, when the sin which they have committed becomes known, the assembly shall offer a bull from the herd for a sin offering. And so we have a bull for them as well. And then when we have a leader among the people. So this is not, you call a priest a leader, but we've already seen the priests. That's back in verse 3. An anointed priest who sins, bringing guilt on the people, he has to bring a bull. But verse 22, when a leader sins, doing unintentionally any one of the things that by the commandments of Yahweh his God ought not to be done, and realizes his guilt, or the sin which he has committed is made known to him, he shall bring as his offering a goat, a male without blemish. Then we're going to see the same kind of thing for, it says, if anyone of the common people, this is verse 27, so anyone in the congregation who's not in this other group, anyone who's not a priest, not a leader, not the entire congregation, just another person in the congregation. And then it says, if he realizes his guilt, or the sin which he has committed is made known to him, he shall bring for his offering a goat, a female without blemish. So you have these different things. You have a bull for one group, a bull for another, a male goat for another, and a female goat for the last group. So what can we see from this? We could just read through all this. We could read through chapter 4 and say, it's like I just read the same thing 4 different times. What's up with that? There's barely any changes, almost copy-paste. It's almost the same thing. You're doing the same process, just, all right, well, if you're in this group, you do this animal, and this group is this animal. And so it can feel really redundant. Why do we have this? What's going on? Well, what are the differences? If you see a lot of repetition and there's something different, let's look at what that is. So notice what's not different. It's not 4 different sacrifices. It's 3. There's 4 different groups, but only 3 different sacrifices. Why could that be? Well, if the priest and the congregation as a whole have the same sacrifice, when it's not always the same, right? Just average Joe congregant over there and a leader, they have different ones, and yet the priest and the whole congregation sins, they have the same sacrifice. We actually see why that is when we read, we just looked at verse 3, if it is the anointed priest who sins, thus bringing guilt on the people. So, here it says, you're bringing guilt. You're the priest, right? Who's the priest? What's the priest supposed to do? You have God's people, and you have God, and you need someone to be a go-between for them. The priest is that go-between. The priest represents God's people to him. So when the priest sins, he's bringing guilt on the whole nation, all of the people. He's the representative, so they're all guilty now. And so he needs to give the same sacrifice that the whole congregation has to give if the whole congregation sins. And this is actually kind of interesting as we think about what happened with Adam and the fact that we're all born sinners. Adam was our representative back in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. But Genesis 3, he sinned and brought the condemnation on all of us. And that's significant too as to why later on in the New Testament when Paul says it's because of Adam that sin entered the world, and he doesn't blame Eve, because Adam was the one that represented us, not Eve. She was there. She also sinned, but her sin wasn't what caused the world to all have, we're all born sinners. And so you have Adam was this representative, and because he sinned, we're all part of that now. We're all born sinners. And here, if a priest sins, the whole congregation is guilty. And so he has to do the same kind of sacrifice as if everyone had actually done something themselves, as if the whole congregation had sinned. So that's very interesting to see here, not only looking back at Adam, but also pointing forward to Jesus. So you have how Adam was a representative. Well, you have Jesus as a representative. In Romans, again, Paul says that Jesus is the second Adam. He calls him the second Adam or the last Adam. And what's that mean? He's also a representative. And even though we aren't perfect, him being perfect, if we're in his group, if we are followers of him, then we are essentially in that same category. He was perfect and sinless, and now us as his followers, we are seen as perfect and sinless because he is our representative rather than Adam being our representative. The first Adam was our representative. If you're a follower of Jesus, the second Adam is your representative. And so that's this kind of seen here in these sin offerings. And so we see that. We see 2 turtle doves or pigeons for when you're poor. It's very interesting when they give offerings in the New Testament. We see when Jesus is born, Mary gives this kind of an offering, indicating that she's giving a sin offering. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that she intentionally sinned or something, but she is having to give a sin offering, even if it's not for some kind of intentional sin. And that's good to notice, because we have people that argue about whether Mary ever sinned in her life. Well, she's giving this kind of an offering, and also giving the kind that a poor person would give. Also gives us an indication of where Jesus was as far as socially, with how much kind of an income his parents had. So knowing this helps you know stuff about Jesus in the New Testament and know about Mary in the New Testament. Let's flip over to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. And this is something that you may have actually heard this verse before and wondered about this. And so this, I think, is a good place to explain it. Chapter 5, verse 21. It references the sin offering. Here we have chapter 5, verse 21. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Now, of course, it's talking about Jesus there. And I always wondered when I heard that verse, what do you mean he became sin? He can't become sin. He's not sinful. He has no sin. How can he become sin? Well, that's actually, that word is there. That's not really a great translation of the word, though, because back here, when we look at the sin offerings, actually, if you know the Hebrew, you'll see that the word for sin and the word for sin offering, same word. You just only know by context. You only know, is it talking about sin or is it talking about a sin offering? Based on the context, and usually it's pretty clear whether it's talking about sin or sin offering. Well, I think what here, Paul, who knows the Old Testament, Paul, who knows the Hebrew, he recognizes that. And what he's doing here, even though now he's writing it in Greek, but he's doing the same thing that we saw in Leviticus. So it should really be, for our sake, he made him to be a sin offering who knew no sin. So it's using the same word, but using it in 2 different ways, just like we saw back in Leviticus, a book of the Bible. It's very familiar to Paul, so he knew that was in there, and I think he's doing the same thing. So he became a sin offering, even though he didn't have sin. And why? So that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So that's what we're seeing in those sin offerings there, which depends on who you are as to what that sin offering looks like. But after that, we get a guilt offering. And in some ways it seems similar, but it is for sin. But in this case, it's for specific kinds of sins, not just for blanket unintentional sin. It's for, well, if it's unintentional sin that's related to certain things, or if it's intentional. And this is pretty different and kind of cool. It's when you have this intentional sin, you're having to reconcile not just with God, but you're having to reconcile with the person that you've wronged. You have to do that first. You notice actually Jesus references this again. So the New Testament's pointing back to all this stuff. So this is all stuff that is still important in Jesus' day in the New Testament. He keeps pointing back to it, and the more you know this, the more when you read the New Testament, you'll say, "Wait, I've heard that before. Oh, that's in Leviticus. And then that's in Numbers. That's in Chronicles. That's in whichever passage of the Bible." But it says in Leviticus chapter 6 that any of these things, if you do this stuff, if he has sinned and has realized his guilt and will restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by oppression, or the deposit that was committed to him, or the lost thing that he found, or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full, and shall add a fifth to it, so 20% more, and give it to him to whom it belongs on the day he realizes his guilt. And he shall bring to the priest as his compensation to Yahweh a ram without blemish out of the flock, or its equivalent, for a guilt offering. So it says when he realizes his guilt, that it doesn't mean there that he didn't know. In the Hebrew, the word there is really talking more about like accepting that, like the fact that, he's admitting his guilt. I guess maybe that's a way to say it. But you see, he's supposed to reconcile with the person that he has wronged, and he takes kind of this punishment, and he not only returns whatever it was, if he stole something, or, he's not, the way to make it right isn't to just put it back to the way it was. He has to do more than that. So, all right, well, I stole $100 from you, so now I'm going to give you 120 back. That kind of a thing, which would also have the added benefit of being a deterrent, where if you don't want to end up losing money. You're trying to steal money to get more, and well, I know that if I take it and I get caught, then I have to return even more back. So that is a deterrent. That's not really the main purpose, though. I think it's instead of taking away from them, instead of harming them, you're blessing them, and you have to make things right with them by doing this. And then you go give the offering. You're making the situation right with the other person, and then you're making it right with God. And so this sacrifice shows another level. It's not just between you and God. There's a communal aspect as well. So that's pretty cool how God does this. How he and then in verse 7, and the priest shall make atonement for him before Yahweh, and he shall be forgiven for any of the things that one may do and thereby become guilty. And so that kind of wraps up that section there with the guilt offering. So these are kind of the big offerings that it talks about in this first chunk of Leviticus. We're going to see, it's going to mention a consecration offering. In the next section, we'll talk about that briefly. And then we'll see one of the biggest ones is the Day of Atonement. It's a whole day, a whole event that is very significant in the life of the Israelites, and points forward to such a significant event in our own lives as well in the New Testament era. And next time we'll continue talking about the offerings from a kind of a different angle in the rest of chapter 6 into chapter 7, before moving on to the ordination, the anointing of the priests, starting in chapter 8. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.